From brutal battles for the crown to royal weddings, watched by billions, the story of the British monarchy is nothing short of legendary. In this gripping deep dive, we unravel over 1,000 years of drama, power, betrayal, and transformation. From William the Conqueror to King Charles III, discover how a once all-powerful institution evolved into a symbol of tradition and controversy. Whether you're a history buff, a fan of royal drama, or just curious about how the British monarchy has managed to survive revolutions, wars, scandals, and modern scrutiny, this video will leave you shocked, fascinated, and wanting more. Before crowns, castles, and coronations, Britain was a land of fragmented tribes, warlords, and wandering kings. The idea of a centralized monarchy was still centuries away, yet the seeds of royal power were already being sown in the blood-soaked soil of early England. It was a time of chaos, where might made right, and the strongest sword often decided the fate of a nation. From the ancient Celts to the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, this is the forgotten foundation of the British crown. By the 9th century, power began to consolidate. One of the earliest figures to rise above the chaos was Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. Unlike others, Alfred wasn't just a warrior. He was a visionary. He fought off Viking invasions, established law codes, and promoted literacy in a time when few even cared to write. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to civilize. And in many ways, his rule laid the groundwork for what would one day become England. But Alfred's dream was fragile. After his death, invasions resumed, kingdoms fractured again, and it seemed like unity was only ever temporary. Then came 1066, the year that changed everything. When Edward the Confessor died without an heir, a power vacuum opened, and 3 men claimed the throne. One of them was William, Duke of Normandy, crossing the English Channel with a fleet of ships and a claim he believed divine. He crushed Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. In one bloody afternoon, the Anglo-Saxon era was dead. William the Conqueror crowned himself King of England, and with him began a dynasty built not just on bloodline, but brute force. William's rule was revolutionary. He didn't just seize power, he systematized it. He introduced feudalism, turning nobles into vassals loyal to him. He ordered the Domesday Book, a massive survey of every asset in his kingdom: livestock, land, people. It was the ultimate power move. If the king knew what you owned, he could control what you owed. The British monarchy, once primitive and scattered, had become a well-oiled machine of control. But power came at a price. Rebellions brewed constantly. Nobles resented William's iron grip, and the English people viewed their new Norman overlords with deep mistrust. Yet despite the unrest, William's legacy endured. His bloodline ruled for centuries, and more importantly, his conquest embedded a simple, undeniable truth into the DNA of British monarchy. Kings weren't born, they were made. Through strategy, conquest, and ruthlessness. The origins of the British monarchy aren't ceremonial or quaint. They're violent, political, and deeply human. Before there were jubilees and televised weddings, there were wars, assassinations, and betrayals. Power wasn't inherited, it was taken and kept by those willing to do whatever it took. And that reality would shape every monarch to come. By the late medieval period, the British crown had evolved from a warlord's prize into a divine institution. Monarchs no longer ruled by force alone. They ruled by divine right. This belief held that kings were chosen by God, answerable to no one on earth. It gave rise to an era of breathtaking power, an unchecked tyranny. The crown was no longer just a symbol. It was absolute authority, embodied in flesh and crowned in gold. One of the most infamous wielders of this divine authority was Henry VIII, Obsessed with control and desperate for a male heir, he tore England from the Catholic Church, launched the English Reformation, and created the Church of England, all so he could divorce his wife. His tyranny was personal and political. 6 marriages, 2 beheaded wives, and monasteries destroyed in a wave of greed disguised as reform. He wasn't just king, he was godlike, and no one could stop him. His daughter, Elizabeth I, inherited not just the crown, but the aura of invincibility. She weaponized her unmarried status, becoming the Virgin Queen, married only to her country. Under Elizabeth, the monarchy became theatrical, a spectacle of strength. She survived assassination plots, crushed the Spanish Armada, and turned England into a rising world power. Yet behind the glamour was paranoia. Dissent was treason. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. Family was no protection. The message was clear. Loyalty wasn't optional. Beneath the pageantry, a darker truth lingered. Absolute monarchy created brilliant rulers, but also tyrants. One moment the crown brought stability, the next, chaos. Monarchs like James I doubled down on divine rule, believing Parliament existed only to fund their extravagance. But the more power kings seized, the more resistance they provoked. The cracks in the absolute monarchy model had begun to show, even as the crown appeared most powerful. Yet, this was also the era where national identity began to take shape. The monarchy wasn't just ruling, it was defining what it meant to be English or British. Royal courts dictated fashion, culture, even religion. Portraits of monarchs replaced religious icons in churches. The monarch was the state, the soul of the nation. But when one person holds that much power, the fall, when it comes, is catastrophic. And that fall was coming. The era of absolute monarchy was glorious, yes, but unstable. The king could decree law, declare war, dissolve parliament, but in doing so, he also built the fuse for a political explosion, because even God's anointed rulers couldn't escape one inconvenient truth. The people were watching, and soon they would fight back. By the early 1600s, Britain was a nation simmering with tension. The monarchy, bloated by power and blinded by divine entitlement, had become dangerously detached from the people, and at the center of the storm stood King Charles I, a monarch who believed he ruled by God's will, even as the nation unraveled beneath his feet. Charles was no tyrant in appearance. He was quiet, elegant, even devout. But beneath his polished surface burned a fatal flaw: arrogance. He repeatedly dismissed Parliament, levied illegal taxes, and surrounded himself with unpopular advisors. To Charles, compromise was weakness, but to a growing segment of the population, his rule was a betrayal of England itself. What followed was not just political crisis, it was civil war. The nation split into two: royalists who backed the king and tradition, and parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell, who demanded limits on royal power. Brothers turned on brothers, cities were sieged, churches were desecrated, and for the first time in English history, the divine aura around kingship began to flicker. After years of brutal fighting, Parliament emerged victorious. Charles was captured, tried for treason, a concept so radical it shook Europe. How could a king, chosen by God, be guilty of betraying his own people? But in 1649, the impossible happened. Charles I was beheaded on a cold January morning. As the axe fell, so did centuries of divine rule. The monarchy abolished, Britain a republic, the world stunned. The aftermath was both radical and revealing. Oliver Cromwell took power not as king, but as Lord Protector, a leader without a crown, yet with more control than any monarch before him. Ironically, his rule became increasingly authoritarian. The people had slain the king to escape tyranny, only to find themselves under a new kind of rule. The idea of a monarch was gone, but not forgotten, because in just over a decade, the monarchy would return. Cromwell died, his republic crumbled, and in 1660, Charles II, son of the executed king, was invited back to the throne. But something had changed. The crown had been bloodied, its power no longer unquestioned. From now on, kings and queens would wear their titles not as divine rights, but as fragile inheritances, earned not just by birth, but by survival. The execution of Charles I wasn't just a moment, it was a message that no power is eternal, that even the most sacred institutions can fall, and that the British monarchy would never again be the same. The return of the monarchy in 1660 may have restored the crown, but it didn't restore its absolute power. The Civil War had changed everything. Kings could no longer rule without scrutiny, and the people, especially Parliament, would never again be silent. Still, some monarchs hadn't received the memo. Enter James II, a king whose stubborn belief in divine authority would ignite one of the most seismic political shifts in British history. James II was Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, autocratic in a nation scarred by tyranny, and deeply out of touch with the political climate. He tried to pack Parliament with loyalists, suspended laws, and placed Catholics in top military positions, all while declaring he had the right to rule unchecked. The country didn't revolt immediately, but the anxiety was palpable. Tensions snapped when his wife gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir. Suddenly, James wasn't just a threat, he was the future. In 1688, a group of English nobles made a bold, history-altering move. They invited William of Orange, a Protestant Dutch prince and James's own son-in-law, to invade England and take the throne. William landed with an army, but no war followed. James fled, and Parliament declared the throne vacant. This bloodless coup became known as the Glorious Revolution, not because it was peaceful, but because of what it represented, a permanent redefinition of monarchy itself. From this moment on, the British monarch would never again rule by divine right. Parliament passed the Bill of Rights in 1689, a groundbreaking document that limited royal authority, safeguarded civil liberties, and ensured Parliament's supremacy in lawmaking. Kings and queens would still reign, but they would no longer rule. Sovereignty shifted, subtly but decisively, to the people's representatives. This was the birth of constitutional monarchy, a system that blended royal symbolism with democratic function. The monarch remained a figurehead, a national symbol. But behind the scenes, power was now balanced, scrutinized, and, most importantly, accountable. In a world still ruled by emperors and despots, this was revolutionary. Yet even as its political power waned, the monarchy's cultural power exploded. Royal portraits, parades, ceremonies, all amplified to maintain the mystique. While Parliament governed, the monarch performed. A curious arrangement had emerged. Real power belonged to politicians, but public loyalty belonged to the crown. The Glorious Revolution wasn't just a regime change, it was a reinvention, one that ensured the monarchy's survival in an age that might have otherwise destroyed it. And it proved that sometimes to endure, even the most powerful institution must evolve or be erased. With its political powers reined in, the British monarchy faced a new question. How could it remain relevant in a changing world? The answer came not through Parliament, but through empire. As Britain expanded across the globe, the monarchy found a new stage and a new purpose as the symbolic face of a growing imperial superpower. Kings and queens who once ruled over a single island now stood at the helm of the largest empire the world had ever seen. At the center of this imperial transformation was Queen Victoria, Her reign, over 63 years, coincided with the height of British global dominance. Railroads, telegraphs, and gunships extended British influence from Canada to India, Australia to Africa. The sun, it was said, never set on the British Empire, and wherever it rose, Victoria's portrait followed. She was more than a monarch, she was an icon, a grandmother to an empire of millions. But this imperial grandeur came with contradictions. The monarchy promoted ideals of civilization and order, even as the empire exploited, oppressed, and divided. British rule in India, for instance, brought railways and bureaucracy, but also famine, rebellion, and deep cultural scars. In Africa, borders were drawn with a ruler, not understanding or caring about the people inside them. Yet back home, the monarchy was adored. Royal jubilees became national spectacles. The monarchy no longer ruled with an iron fist, but with something arguably more powerful: myth. It was during this era that royal traditions became deeply entrenched. Ceremonies like coronations, royal weddings, and garden parties weren't just pageantry. They were political theater. They reinforced a sense of unity, loyalty, and imperial pride. And in return, the public gave the monarchy its most vital currency: devotion. Even as power quietly shifted to elected officials, the monarchy thrived as a brand. However, the cracks were always there. The empire's reach exceeded its grasp. Resistance movements grew. The horrors of colonization became harder to hide. After World War I, the global order began to shift. Nationalist uprisings, economic strain, and the horrors of mechanized war weakened the empire's grip. By World War II, the illusion of British omnipotence was fading, and with it, the unshakable image of the monarchy as global overseer began to dim. Yet the institution endured, because while empires fall, myths are harder to kill. The monarchy had evolved from warlords to emperors and now, slowly, into ceremonial custodians of tradition. Their real estate may have shrunk, but their symbolic influence remained massive, not through conquest anymore, but through continuity. And so, as the empire dissolved, the monarchy didn't collapse with it. Instead, it transformed once again, preparing for a modern world where crowns were no longer tools of domination, but symbols of unity in a fractured age. By the 20th century, the British monarchy had weathered wars, revolutions, and the collapse of an empire. But its greatest challenge wasn't an invading army. It was its own reflection. For the first time in history, royals were no longer distant figures seen once a year. They were everywhere, in newspapers, on television, eventually on the internet. With mass media came mass scrutiny, and suddenly, every royal misstep became front-page news. The first seismic tremor came in 1936, when King Edward VIII abandoned the throne for love. His decision to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, sparked a constitutional crisis. The monarchy and the Church of England couldn't tolerate a king who broke with tradition so openly. Edward chose passion over duty and abdicated, forever changing the line of succession. In his place rose George VI, a shy, reluctant king who would lead the nation through World War II and restore public faith in the monarchy. But the damage was done. The public now saw the royal family as vulnerable, even fallible. Then came the second blow. Princess Margaret, glamorous, rebellious, and defiant, Margaret challenged the royal mold. Her doomed romance with a divorced war hero, Peter Townsend, ended under pressure from the palace and the press. The message was clear. Even within the royal family, love was negotiable. Appearances mattered more, yet the public loved her precisely for her flaws. Margaret's heartbreak marked a turning point, the beginning of the monarchy's long, slow battle with its own image. But nothing, absolutely nothing, would shake the monarchy more than Princess Diana. When Lady Diana Spencer married Prince Charles in 1981, it seemed like a fairy tale. The world watched in awe. But behind the palace walls, the story was darker. Infidelity, isolation, and emotional turmoil plagued their marriage. Diana, open and vulnerable, became a symbol of compassion and modernity. The palace, cold and silent, became a symbol of everything outdated. The separation, the divorce, the interviews. All of it played out under the harsh glare of a 24-hour media machine. Then, tragedy struck. In 1997, Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. The grief was global. The outrage was personal. The royal family's muted response sparked a national backlash. Where was the Queen? Why no flag at half-mast? For a moment, the monarchy looked dangerously out of touch, even heartless. It took a rare televised address from Queen Elizabeth II to calm the storm. But the scars ran deep. The monarchy had survived wars, but Diana's death nearly broke it. This era revealed the monarchy's greatest paradox. It depended on mystery, yet lived under a microscope. It stood for tradition, yet was judged by modern values. Divorce, scandal, emotional trauma, once unthinkable topics for royals, became public conversations. And as the 20th century drew to a close, one truth became unavoidable. To survive the next century, the monarchy couldn't simply endure. It would have to transform. If the British monarchy survived the 20th century, it was largely because of one woman, Queen Elizabeth II. Crowned in 1953, just after the trauma of World War II and the abdication scandal, she represented something Britain craved: stability. For over 70 years, Elizabeth was more than a monarch. She was a constant in a world that refused to stand still. But Elizabeth was not a revolutionary. She didn't modernize the monarchy through bold reforms. She did it by mastering the art of controlled evolution. She allowed the monarchy to be televised, bringing coronations and Christmas addresses into people's living rooms. She slimmed down the royal household, adapting to a Britain that no longer ruled half the globe. And above all, she followed a simple but powerful rule: never explain, never complain. Her silence became her shield. Still, the monarchy she led wasn't just a family. It was a corporation, often referred to as the firm. Its members had roles, responsibilities, and reputations to maintain. Behind the formality was a sprawling operation of staff, media management, and strategic planning. Every appearance, handshake, and outfit was part of the performance. A centuries-old brand kept alive by relentless precision. But public opinion is a fragile foundation, and in the age of social media, the firm's control over narrative began to slip. Younger royals like William and Kate, and more disruptively, Harry and Meghan, brought fresh energy, but also fresh controversy. Meghan's marriage into the family was historic, but her and Harry's eventual departure was explosive. Their claims of racism, mental health struggles, and institutional coldness during a bombshell Oprah interview in 2021 echoed Diana's cries for help decades earlier. But this time, millions were listening instantly and globally. Through all of this, Queen Elizabeth remained outwardly unshaken. Her quiet dignity won her admiration even among Republicans. She became a kind of living institution, not above criticism, but beyond replacement. Yet her popularity highlighted the monarchy's existential challenge. What happens when the monarch is more respected than the monarchy itself? The Queen's Platinum Jubilee in 2022 was a stunning display of pageantry and nostalgia, but beneath the glitter, a generational question loomed. Could the monarchy survive without her? Would loyalty to the crown endure in a world demanding transparency, accountability, and modern relevance? Queen Elizabeth II didn't just guide the monarchy through crisis. She was the monarchy for much of the modern era. But with her passing in 2022, the spotlight shifted. And as the crown moved to her son, Charles, the nation and the world turned its gaze forward, asking, what next? When Queen Elizabeth II passed in 2022, it wasn't just the end of a reign. It was the end of an era. For most people alive, she had always been the Queen. Her face on coins, her voice at Christmas, her name tied to everything from post boxes to public trust. Now that immense symbolic weight passed to her son, King Charles III, a man born to rule, but stepping into a role as the world questioned whether monarchy itself should still exist. Charles was never just a prince in waiting. He was a deeply complex figure, sensitive, outspoken, and at times controversial. For decades, he struggled in the shadows of a mother who never faltered and a public who never fully embraced him. His failed marriage to Princess Diana, his long-standing relationship with Camilla, and his perceived aloofness made him one of the most criticized heirs in modern history. But time and persistence reshaped the narrative. As king, Charles brings something no monarch has had before, a lifetime of preparation. He understands the machinery, the politics, and the pressure. But more importantly, he brings causes. Long before climate change became a global emergency, Charles was speaking about sustainability. Long before mental health became a buzzword, he championed holistic well-being. As king, he seems determined to blend tradition with relevance. Still, the challenges ahead are massive. The Commonwealth, once a jewel of the royal legacy, is cracking. Countries like Barbados have already cut ties with the crown, and others, from Jamaica to Australia, are openly discussing becoming republics. Within the UK, Republican sentiment is growing, especially among the young. The monarchy faces questions it can no longer ignore. What is its purpose? Who does it serve? And can it survive in a world that no longer believes in unquestioned power? To adapt, Charles has hinted at a slimmed-down monarchy. Fewer working royals, more transparency, less grandeur. But symbolism is hard to scale back. The coronation, though modernized, still dripped with gold, jewels, and centuries of imperial legacy. Can the monarchy truly modernize without shedding the very mystique that keeps it alive? And then there's the next generation. Prince William and Princess Kate are seen as the monarchy's best hope, relatable, polished, and scandal-free. But even they must walk a tightrope between tradition and authenticity. Behind them, Prince George is growing up in a world radically different from the one Charles or Elizabeth knew. If he wears the crown one day, it will be on very different terms. The future of the monarchy doesn't lie in golden thrones or historic titles. It lies in its ability to evolve, not just to survive change, but to earn its place in it. Whether the crown endures another century or quietly fades into history will depend on something far more fragile than lineage or law, the will of the people. And that's the great irony. After 1,000 years of battles, marriages, revolutions, and reform, the fate of the British monarchy no longer rests in the hands of kings or queens, but in ours.